Don't scroll. Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear isn't just another story. It begins with a moment that changed two hearts forever. Somewhere, at a time that felt completely ordinary, your soulmate believed they had finally learned how to live without saying your name. They had spent countless days convincing themselves that silence was stronger than honesty, that hiding their emotions would somehow protect them from the ache they carried inside. Every morning they woke up with the same promise: today I won't think about them. Every night they failed to keep that promise. The memories refused to fade. They lingered in quiet places, in familiar songs, in unexpected smiles, in little moments that no one else noticed. They tried to move forward, but every step somehow led back to the same place, you. They never planned to admit it. In fact, they believed they never would. They built walls around their heart so high that even they forgot what existed behind them. But hearts have a strange way of speaking when they can no longer carry the weight of unspoken feelings. One conversation changed everything. One unexpected question broke every defense they had built. Someone looked into their eyes and simply asked, "Is there still someone you can't forget?" There was a long silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than words. Their heartbeat grew faster. Their hands trembled. Their mind searched desperately for another answer, another name, another lie. But the truth was stronger than fear. Before they could stop themselves, your name escaped their lips. The room became completely still. Even they couldn't believe what they had just done. The words had already been spoken. They could never take them back. For the first time in a very long time, they stopped pretending. They admitted that no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much distance stood between you, a part of their heart had never stopped choosing you. They confessed that every attempt to replace your memory only reminded them that no one else carried the light your soul brought into their life. They confessed that sometimes they smiled in front of everyone while secretly wishing they could hear your voice just one more time. They confessed that the greatest mistake they ever made wasn't loving you, it was believing they had to hide that love. Those words changed something inside them forever. Once truth leaves the heart, it refuses to return to silence. From that moment onward, everything around them began to feel different. Familiar places suddenly reminded them of moments they had shared with you. Songs they hadn't heard in years somehow found their way back into their life. Tiny coincidences began appearing one after another, making it impossible to ignore the connection they thought had disappeared. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. What if they had walked away too soon? What if fear had stolen a future that was meant to be lived together? What if destiny had never stopped waiting for both of you? Those questions echoed louder every single day. They realized that love doesn't disappear simply because people stop talking. Real love waits. Real love remembers. Real love survives even when pride, distance, misunderstandings, and time try to bury it. And as those realizations grew stronger, something remarkable happened. They stopped running from their feelings. Instead, they began listening to them. Every quiet night became an honest conversation with their own heart. Every sunrise reminded them that another day had passed without telling you the truth. Regret slowly replaced denial. Hope slowly replaced fear. Deep inside, they knew they could no longer hide from what their soul had already accepted. They had spoken words they could never take back, and somehow those words became the beginning of a completely different journey. They didn't know where that journey would lead, but for the first time in a long time, they felt alive. They felt vulnerable. They felt terrified. But above all, they felt honest. And honesty carries a power that no lie can ever defeat. What they didn't realize was that the moment they finally admitted the truth, invisible doors had already begun opening. The story they believed had ended was quietly preparing for another chapter. The confession they made wasn't the end, it was the first page of something much bigger. Somewhere beyond everything either of you could see, circumstances were beginning to shift. Old obstacles were weakening. Old fears were losing their grip. Pieces that once seemed completely broken were slowly moving back toward each other. Neither of you could see it yet, but the journey had already begun. And your soulmate, sitting alone with their thoughts, whispered one final sentence into the silence, a sentence so powerful that it changed everything inside their heart forever. I never stopped loving you. That was the moment they realized there was no going back. The truth had been spoken, and nothing in their life would ever feel the same again. Their next decision would become the most important decision they had ever made, and that decision is where this story truly begins. They sat in complete silence after those words left their lips. The air felt heavier than before, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the truth they had been hiding for so long. Their heart raced, not because someone judged them, but because they finally heard themselves say what their soul had been whispering for months. There was no denial left. No excuse to hide behind. No carefully crafted explanation to protect their pride. They had admitted that they never stopped loving you, and from that single moment forward, every part of their world began to look different. The familiar streets they walked every day suddenly carried memories they had forgotten they still possessed. Every cafe reminded them of conversations they wished had lasted longer. Every sunset reminded them of promises that were never spoken aloud but somehow lived quietly between two hearts. Every laugh they heard from strangers reminded them of the happiness they once imagined sharing with you. They tried to distract themselves by filling every hour with work, responsibilities, and endless routines, but the quieter their surroundings became, the louder your memory echoed inside them. At night they stared at the ceiling wondering how they had convinced themselves that silence was the right decision. They replayed every conversation, searching for the exact moment fear became stronger than love. Was it the misunderstanding neither of you knew how to fix? Was it the distance that slowly grew between two hearts? Or was it simply the fear of being vulnerable with the one person who mattered most? The answers refused to come easily, but one truth remained impossible to ignore. No matter how many questions they asked themselves, every answer somehow led back to you. They realized that some people enter your life for a season, while others become part of your soul forever. You were never just another chapter. You became the story they measured every future against. Every person they met afterward was unknowingly compared to the kindness they remembered in you, the comfort they felt around you, and the peace they could never recreate anywhere else. That realization frightened them because it meant they had never truly moved on. They had only learned how to hide the pain better. But hiding pain is not the same as healing it. One evening they opened an old box they had not touched in years. Inside were forgotten photographs, little notes, tiny reminders of moments that once seemed ordinary but had quietly become priceless. As they held those memories in their hands, tears appeared before they even realized they were crying. Not because they were weak, but because the heart grows tired of carrying emotions it was never meant to bury forever. They whispered your name again, softer this time, almost like a prayer carried by the wind. For the first time they didn't ask whether you still remembered them. Instead, they asked whether they still deserved another chance. That question stayed with them for days. They understood that love is not only about being chosen, it is also about having the courage to choose someone without letting fear decide your future. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began changing. They became more honest with themselves. They stopped pretending everything was fine. They admitted their mistakes instead of blaming circumstances. They accepted that pride had protected their ego while quietly breaking their own heart. Each realization felt painful, but every painful truth also made them stronger. They no longer wanted to be the person who watched life happen from a distance. They wanted to become someone brave enough to speak before silence stole another opportunity. Friends noticed something had changed. Their smile looked different. Their eyes carried both sadness and hope at the same time. When people asked what was happening, they simply smiled and said they had finally remembered what truly mattered. They didn't explain further because some stories cannot be understood unless someone has loved with every piece of their heart. Deep inside, a decision was beginning to form. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't driven by loneliness. It was built slowly, one honest thought after another. They decided that if life gave them even the smallest opportunity to make things right, they would never waste it again. They would no longer wait for perfect timing because they finally understood that perfect timing rarely arrives on its own. Sometimes it is created by one courageous step, one sincere apology, one truthful conversation. That realization became the turning point of their journey. They imagined what they would say if they ever stood in front of you again. They practiced countless conversations in their mind. They imagined apologizing for every moment when fear spoke louder than love. They imagined thanking you for changing their life in ways they only understood after losing your presence. They imagined looking into your eyes and telling you that every road they walked eventually led them back to the same truth. Some connections cannot be replaced because they were never ordinary to begin with. The closer they came to making that decision, the stronger their heartbeat became. Hope returned, but so did uncertainty. What if too much time had passed? What if your heart had already chosen a different path? What if they had waited too long? Those fears tried to stop them once again, yet something inside refused to surrender this time. They reminded themselves that living with an honest answer, even if it hurt, would always be better than living forever with unanswered questions. So they made a quiet promise to themselves. The next time destiny opened even the smallest door, they would walk through it without hesitation. No more hiding. No more pretending. No more letting silence speak in place of the heart. Little did they know, at that very moment, events beyond their control were already beginning to align in unexpected ways. A chance encounter, an old connection, an unexpected message, a familiar place. Pieces of a much larger story were quietly moving into place. Neither of you could see the full picture yet, but change had already begun. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time, not certainty, not confidence, but hope. A hope so powerful that it convinced them this story was far from over, and that the words they could never take back might one day become the very words that finally brought two hearts face to face again. As the days passed, that quiet hope refused to fade. Instead, it grew stronger with every sunrise, with every moment of unexpected silence, with every memory that returned without warning. Your soulmate no longer tried to push those thoughts away because they had finally realized that some feelings are not meant to be erased, they are meant to be understood. Every path they walked seemed to carry a reminder of you. Every familiar place whispered the same question into their heart: what if it's not too late? They found themselves stopping in the middle of ordinary moments, smiling without realizing it because a memory of you had quietly crossed their mind. It wasn't always a dramatic memory. Sometimes it was the way you laughed. Sometimes it was the kindness in your eyes. Sometimes it was a simple conversation that meant nothing to anyone else but somehow meant everything to them. Those little moments became impossible to ignore because they revealed a truth they had spent too long denying. Love had never disappeared. It had simply waited beneath layers of fear, pride, and silence. Now those layers were falling away one by one. They began writing letters they never intended to send. Page after page filled with words they wished they had spoken when they still had the chance. Every sentence carried honesty instead of excuses. Every paragraph admitted another mistake. They apologized for every moment they chose silence instead of courage, for every misunderstanding they allowed to grow, for every opportunity they let slip away because they believed there would always be another tomorrow. But tomorrow never promises itself to anyone, and they understood that now better than ever before. One evening they looked at the final page of those letters and quietly whispered, "If I ever stand before them again, I won't waste another second pretending I don't care." That promise became part of who they were. It changed the way they looked at life. It changed the way they looked at themselves. They no longer measured success by achievements or possessions. Instead, they began measuring life by honesty, by kindness, and by the courage to love without hiding behind fear. Friends noticed the transformation long before they spoke about it. There was a softness in their voice that hadn't existed before. There was patience where frustration once lived. There was gratitude where regret had once taken control. Someone finally asked them what had caused such a profound change. They smiled quietly before answering. Sometimes losing something teaches you exactly how valuable it always was. No one asked another question because the emotion in their eyes already told the rest of the story. They had learned a lesson that only the heart can truly understand. Yet despite all this growth, one fear still remained. What if your heart had already moved forward? What if the chance they were hoping for had already disappeared forever? Those thoughts returned during quiet nights, testing the strength of the hope they had begun rebuilding. But instead of allowing fear to win again, they answered those doubts with a simple truth: I'd rather face an honest answer than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened. That single decision gave them peace they hadn't felt in years. They stopped waiting for perfect signs. They stopped believing they needed certainty before taking action. They finally understood that courage always comes before clarity, never after it. And with that realization came another unexpected change. They started preparing themselves not only to speak, but also to listen. They wanted to hear your story. They wanted to understand your journey, your growth, your victories, your struggles, and every chapter that life had written while you were apart. They realized that love isn't only about expressing your own heart, it's also about creating space for another heart to be fully heard. That understanding humbled them in ways they never expected. Somewhere else, life continued moving quietly, weaving together moments neither of you could yet recognize as meaningful. Familiar names appeared unexpectedly. Places once forgotten suddenly became part of new conversations. Small coincidences began stacking upon one another until they no longer felt random at all. Your soulmate couldn't explain why they suddenly felt drawn toward places they hadn't visited in years, or why certain dates stayed on their mind without any obvious reason. They simply followed those quiet instincts because something deep inside whispered that not every important moment announces itself loudly. Some arrived gently, disguised as ordinary days. And then one morning they woke with an unusual sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, fear wasn't the first feeling waiting for them. Instead, there was quiet determination. They looked into the mirror and saw someone different, not because their appearance had changed, but because their heart had. The person staring back was no longer hiding from love. They were no longer running from truth. They were finally becoming the person they wished they had been all along. Standing there, they smiled and spoke aloud, "No matter what happens next, I won't betray my heart again." Those words carried more strength than any promise they had ever made before. From that day forward, every decision reflected that commitment. They became more present with the people around them. They expressed gratitude more often. They stopped assuming tomorrow would always provide another opportunity. They began living with the awareness that every meaningful conversation deserves honesty, every goodbye deserves kindness, and every important person deserves to know how deeply they are valued. And yet, despite all the healing they had experienced, one truth remained unchanged above all others. Whenever they imagined a future that truly felt complete, your presence was still there. Not because they refused to let go of the past, but because every lesson they learned somehow led them back to the same destination. They no longer saw your story as something broken. They saw it as unfinished. And somewhere in the quiet corners of their heart, beyond all fear and beyond every unanswered question, they carried one unwavering belief, that if two souls are truly meant to meet again, life has remarkable ways of creating that opportunity when both hearts are finally ready to recognize its value. With that belief guiding every step, they walked into the unknown with more courage than ever before, unaware that the next chapter of their journey would begin far sooner than they ever imagined. They carried that quiet hope with them into every new day, not as a fantasy, but as a reminder of the person they had become. Every sunrise felt like another chance to choose honesty over fear. Every sunset reminded them that time never stops for anyone, and that the words left unspoken today can become tomorrow's deepest regret. They had learned that lesson the hard way, and they refused to repeat it. Weeks passed, yet the feeling inside them refused to fade. Instead, it became calmer, stronger, and more certain. It was no longer the desperate longing that once kept them awake at night. It had transformed into something far more powerful, a quiet conviction that some connections deserve patience, courage, and faith. They stopped asking themselves whether they should reach out. Instead, they began asking themselves how they could become someone worthy of the love they still carried. That question changed everything. They became kinder without expecting anything in return. They forgave people who had hurt them because they understood how heavy unforgiveness truly feels. They apologized where they had once defended themselves. They listened more than they spoke. They smiled more often. They discovered that healing was not about forgetting the past, it was about allowing the past to shape a better future. Every step they took toward becoming a better version of themselves somehow brought them emotionally closer to you. They couldn't explain why, but every positive change reminded them of the promises they wished they had made when they still had the chance. Sometimes they would sit quietly with a cup of coffee, watching the world move around them, wondering where you might be at that exact moment. Were you laughing with friends? Were you chasing your dreams? Were you looking at the same evening sky? Those thoughts no longer filled them with sadness alone. They also filled them with gratitude because loving someone had taught them lessons they would never have learned otherwise. Love had shown them patience. It had taught them humility. It had revealed that vulnerability is not weakness but one of the greatest forms of courage a person can possess. They realized that before meeting you, they believed strength meant hiding emotions. Now they understood that real strength means speaking the truth even when your voice trembles. One quiet afternoon they found themselves walking through a familiar place they hadn't visited in years. Everything looked almost the same, yet everything felt different. Memories greeted them from every corner. They paused for a moment, closed their eyes, and smiled softly. Instead of wishing they could go back in time, they whispered, "Thank you for every moment, even the painful ones, because they brought me here." That single sentence surprised even them. It was the first time they had looked back without bitterness. The first time they had accepted that every chapter, joyful or painful, had shaped the person they were becoming. As they continued walking, they noticed something unexpected. The world no longer seemed empty. It seemed full of possibilities. Not because they knew what the future held, but because they had stopped letting fear write their story. Hope had quietly taken the pen. That evening they opened their journal again. This time they didn't write about regret. They wrote about gratitude. They thanked life for teaching them that genuine love cannot be measured by how easy the journey is but by how deeply it changes the people involved. They thanked every challenge that forced them to grow. They thanked every mistake that taught them wisdom. And at the bottom of the page, they wrote one final sentence: "If our paths cross again, I will meet them with honesty instead of hesitation." After closing the journal, they felt an unfamiliar peace settle over their heart. It wasn't the peace of knowing every answer. It was the peace of accepting uncertainty without surrendering hope. Days turned into more days, and with each passing moment they became more prepared for whatever life had planned. They no longer imagined dramatic speeches or perfect reunions. They simply hoped for one genuine conversation, one opportunity to speak openly, one chance to let truth replace silence. They understood that even if the future unfolded differently than they imagined, they would never again betray their own heart by pretending not to care. That promise became the foundation of every choice they made. Then, on what appeared to be an ordinary day, something unexpected happened. A familiar name appeared where they least expected it. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Their heartbeat grew louder. Their hands froze. Countless memories rushed back at once, yet instead of panicking, they smiled. Not because they knew what would happen next, but because life had quietly reminded them that unexpected moments often become the beginning of extraordinary stories. They took a slow breath and whispered to themselves, "Whatever comes next, I will face it with courage." Those words carried no fear, only quiet determination. In that moment they finally understood the greatest lesson their journey had given them. Love is not about controlling outcomes. It is about showing up with honesty, compassion, and an open heart regardless of what tomorrow may bring. And as they stepped forward into that unknown moment, they felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time, not certainty, not excitement alone, but deep, unwavering peace. The kind of peace that comes only when a heart has stopped running from its own truth. They smiled toward the horizon, knowing that some stories are written in silence long before they are spoken aloud, and believing that whatever chapter awaited them next, they would never again allow fear to speak louder than love. They stood still for what felt like forever, taking one slow breath after another as they realized that life had quietly brought them to the very moment they had imagined so many times. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing signs in the sky, no perfect music playing in the background, no magical certainty that everything would unfold exactly as they hoped. Instead, there was something far more meaningful, an opportunity. An opportunity to stop hiding, to stop running, and to finally let honesty replace the silence that had controlled so much of their journey. Every lesson they had learned suddenly made sense. Every tear, every sleepless night, every unanswered question had shaped them into someone who no longer feared the truth. They understood that love is never proven by grand speeches alone. It is proven by courage, patience, kindness, forgiveness, and the willingness to become a better person even when no one is watching. As they reflected on everything that had happened, they realized that the greatest change had not been in the circumstances around them. The greatest change had happened inside their own heart. The person who once allowed pride to speak louder than love no longer existed. The person who believed silence could protect them had disappeared. In their place stood someone who finally understood that every meaningful relationship deserves honesty before it deserves certainty. They smiled quietly because they no longer carried the heavy burden of pretending. Whether the future brought another beginning or simply a peaceful goodbye, they knew one thing with complete clarity: they would never again leave important words unspoken. Every heartbeat reminded them that life is too precious to postpone love until tomorrow. Tomorrow is a promise no one truly owns. Only this moment belongs to us. Only this chance is real. As they continued walking forward, they carried no anger toward the past. Regret had transformed into wisdom. Pain had transformed into compassion. Fear had transformed into courage. Those transformations became the greatest gift the journey had given them. They understood that sometimes the universe does not change our path by changing other people first. Sometimes it changes us, and through that change, everything else begins to look different. They no longer blamed fate for every obstacle. They no longer searched endlessly for someone else to explain what had happened. Instead, they accepted responsibility for the moments they could have been braver, kinder, and more honest. Strangely, accepting those truths didn't make them weaker. It made them feel lighter than they had in years. The weight they had carried for so long slowly disappeared because truth has a remarkable way of setting the heart free. They thought back to the moment when your name first slipped from their lips without warning. At the time, it felt terrifying. Now they realized it had been the beginning of their freedom. The words they believed they could never take back became the words that finally allowed them to stop hiding from themselves. They no longer wished they had remained silent. They were grateful they hadn't. Because once the truth was spoken, healing became possible. Growth became possible. Hope became possible. They looked toward the future with quiet confidence, not because they believed life would be perfect, but because they finally trusted themselves to face whatever came next with honesty. They promised that no matter where life led them, they would continue choosing kindness over bitterness, understanding over judgment, and courage over fear. Those promises became more valuable than any outcome they could imagine. Whether destiny eventually reunited two hearts or guided them onto different roads, they knew their journey had already changed them forever. They had learned that genuine love is never wasted. Even when it hurts, it teaches. Even when it ends, it transforms. Even when it feels uncertain, it reveals parts of ourselves we never knew existed. They understood that every meaningful connection leaves behind wisdom that continues shaping us long after the moment has passed. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that life always unfolds exactly the way we hope, but that love has the power to make us wiser, gentler, and stronger than we were before. They lifted their eyes toward the horizon one last time and smiled, not because every question had been answered, but because they no longer needed every answer to move forward. Peace had replaced confusion. Acceptance had replaced resistance. Hope had replaced despair. They finally understood that the words they could never take back were never meant to be a burden. They were meant to be the beginning of a new chapter built on honesty instead of fear. And with one final deep breath, they whispered softly into the quiet evening, "Whatever tomorrow brings, I am grateful for every lesson, every memory, and every moment that taught me how to love with an open heart." The wind carried those words into the distance, and for the first time in a very long while, their heart felt completely at peace. The story was no longer about chasing what had been lost. It was about honoring what had been learned, embracing who they had become, and walking confidently toward whatever future awaited them. Some stories end with certainty. Others end with hope. This one ended with something even more powerful, the courage to choose truth over fear, love over pride, and growth over regret. And perhaps that is the ending every heart quietly searches for, because the greatest victory is not simply finding love, but becoming the kind of person who is never afraid to give it honestly. The end.